Our parsha this week has a lot of interesting parts of it, but there's one part I wanted to focus on and use that to actually jump off into a different but related topic. And it's part of the idea of the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. Our parsha refers back to earlier in the Torah, when God gives the commandment that every 7th year, all of the loans must be forgiven. And it's very relevant. I imagine there are a lot of my colleagues right now down south in the U.S. talking about this, given what's been happening in American politics and in discourse about loan forgiveness. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the mitzvah in general, and where it comes from, why it exists, and how it actually plays out in real life. The seemingly obvious reason for this mitzvah, to forgive all loans every 7 years, is about justice and equity, to create a fair and equitable society for all. We often talk today about that as tikkun olam, repairing the world, social justice. But it's interesting, actually, because the very first time, or one of the very first times we come across the phrase tikkun olam, is back in the Mishnah for Gittin. And it talks about a few different cases where the rabbis changed a rule, mipnei tikkun olam, because of tikkun haolam, for the sake of repairing the world. And one of those first cases where we see this phrase, tikkun haolam, is in relation to the idea of a prus bowl. I don't expect you would have heard that word. It's borrowed from the Greek. But the rabbis understand that and use that as the term to cover a halachic loophole to forgiving loans. A way of getting out of forgiving the loans every 7 years, so a lender can collect from someone they lended money to, even beyond the Shemitah, the 7-year sabbatical cycle. And the rabbis create this loophole, mipnei tikkun haolam. Hillel actually is the rabbi that creates this loophole. So the question then is why? Why, for the sake of justice, why to repair the world, is there a loophole created which creates essentially that debt is never forgiven? Someone who takes a loan has to repay it. Why do you think that is? Wonderful answer, Ephraim. That's exactly why. Otherwise, nobody would loan anyone money. Maybe in the first or the second or the third year of the sabbatical cycle, someone might issue a loan. But as you got closer and closer to that 7th year, those who had what we might call lower and lower credit scores, those who needed the money the most, those who were most impoverished, were not given loans. Because nobody wanted to risk that the loan would be forgiven and they'd be out the money. So what was the result of a law that was created in the Torah for the sake of justice? It led to circumstances on the ground where people actually suffered. People could not receive the help that they needed. It created an undue burden on the community. And so, Rabbi Hillel created the prus bowl, mipnei tikkun olam, to repair the world. There was an accidental consequence of the law, and it was changed. And the idea of changing Jewish law to avoid placing an undue burden on the community is actually very common and an essential principle in halakha and how Jewish law plays out throughout history. There's another situation related to the sabbatical year, which is every 7 years, you have to let the land rest. You can't grow anything on it. You have to leave it as it is. It gets a rest, the same as the rest of us. But what happened when the state of Israel was refounded? They needed fruits and vegetables. They needed things grown so that the people could eat them. The farmers needed to make money, needed an economy. So Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, created an idea of the cheter mechira, a way of selling the land. So someone else owned it that wasn't Jewish, and you could keep farming and selling and eating the produce and growing on it. So that those living in Israel would have food, those growing the food would have an income, a livelihood. Because the law, which was meant to give people a rest, to give the land a rest, to give the workers and the farmers and the agriculturists rest, in the end created an undue burden. The state of Israel could not exist had that law been followed exactly as it was laid out in the Torah. So like selling our chumetz on Pesach to a non-Jew, Rav Kook created the Heter Mechira so we could have a loophole and continue to farm the land, because it would have placed an undue burden on the community. Today, many in Israel rely on other loopholes that have been invented in the decades since. Tomatoes grown hydroponically and other things aren't actually in the ground's resting. So if you build a bed above ground and grow your fruit or vegetables in water, which a lot you can, not all, but a lot of vegetables you can do that, I'm told, you don't even have to worry about it. All throughout Jewish history, since Moses and the daughters of Zelophehad, religious authorities and leaders have sought to act reasonably within the law, to make sure that it doesn't place an undue burden on those who have to observe it, on the community. The Rambam, long before rabbis today complained that people talk during high holiday services, 1,000 years ago said people talk during high holiday services. So what did he do? What was his suggestion? One of the greatest rabbis of all of Jewish history. It wasn't to yell at people who talked. It wasn't to give more announcements that you shouldn't talk at services. It wasn't to put up signs around the synagogue saying, stop talking. It wasn't to shush people. It wasn't to expect them to do more than they could do. What was his solution? Shorten the service. Shorten the service. The truth is, in Jewish law, there are cases of right and wrong. There are cases of yes and no, kosher or treif. And there are also many things that the answer really depends on custom. There are many cases where 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 answers, or more even, are correct and appropriate, and a community can choose for itself which ones it observes, which ones it follows. We see that with kashrut. There are differences in how kashrut is observed in Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, and even within those communities, how the law is applied. But there's a principle in Jewish law of not burdening the community, making life as easy as possible for them. And all throughout history, there have been clergy and leaders and rabbis that didn't set that example. All throughout Jewish history, we've had rabbis who have. In the Talmud, there's a story about these rabbis, because their students are supposed to rise when they see them. These rabbis, for some of their older students, those who maybe were workers in the field and having a long day hot in the sun and taking a break, they saw them up ahead on the road, they would walk around the long way, these rabbis, so their students wouldn't have to rise up when they passed by to spare them the burden. There's choices. And it's going to be the halakhic policy of this community, of our shul Beth Torah, that whenever there are differing customs, we're going to pick the one that is easiest for people to observe. We're going to pick the one that will be the least burden on our community, on our members. The path that will be easiest for more people to observe Jewish law, to live a life of mitzvot, to live a life of Torah, and to be a part of the community. Our job as a synagogue is to make life easier, not more difficult. So I mention all of this because I want to start thinking as we prepare for the year to come, after a year of getting to know this community. And what I'm saying, to be clear, is not that we're going to be lax in observance. We're a traditional community, but also a modern community. We're a community based in halakha and Jewish law, and also a community based in progressive values and welcoming everyone, and ensuring that everyone can participate in our community, no matter who they are. So when it comes to customs, where there are multiple answers that are correct, I want to create a space where everyone feels comfortable observing the customs that they feel most in line with. I'm not asking people to change theirs. When we talked about standing for the prayer for the new month, Birkat HaChodesh, many people have the custom to stand for the entire prayer. There are also some communities that don't. But it's halachic to stand when the Torah is lifted. And that's what's going to be our standard. And if people want to stand beforehand, they should feel more than welcome to. But no one should feel obligated to. Because it's true, for some, it's a burden to stand for a long time. For other prayers like the Baruch Hu or the Amidah, it's halakha to stand. For those who really physically cannot stand, the halakha is for you to sit, to be very clear. But for those who would like to sit for prayers that some have the custom to stand and others don't, whether it's a Kaddish or it's Yishtabach, our policy is going to be officially that we pick the lenient opinion, the one that's the easiest for people to follow. And at the same time, for those who wish to stand for a prayer, those who wish to take on a more strict observance of any of the mitzvot, it's a wonderful thing, and you're more than welcome to do that. We're going to create a space where people with different customs can come together and celebrate our shared culture, our shared values, our shared history. But from here forward, that's our halakhic practice, to ensure that our tradition isn't a burden for those we wish to observe. But like the Rambam, shorten the service. Welcome people. Find a way to meet people where they are and bring them in to our space and to our heritage as we build a future for another 1,000 years of Jewish life. Shabbat Shalom.